Hey everyone. Welcome to your introduction to Romanticism, otherwise entitled Every Era Has Their Reactionaries. As I described in my intro video to the Regency period, historically speaking, the time that we're in for this unit is the Regency-Era. The artistic movement that we're going to study, which sort of evolved out of this time period and in reaction to this time period, is Romanticism. So specifically when you're studying art history or music history or literature, people might talk about the Romantic period, and that's because they're talking about the movement. In my introduction to the Regency, I spent a little bit of time describing the extraordinary decadence and self-indulgence of the Prince Regent as a kind of character of the period or a public persona that was just totally incongruous, with Regency-era values as we understand them, through the works of writers like Jane Austen. The debt that he racked up with his lifestyle that Parliament had to gradually bail him out of, one can only presume, with public tax money. This was exactly the decadence and the self-indulgence that common people were so enraged by in France toward the end of the 18th century, and a big part of what fueled the French Revolution and its very bloody aftermath, which we also discussed in the previous video. And of course, at this time, the abolitionist cause is really running at full steam, as well as some other reform movements concerning government and social justice. So Romanticism as an art movement shared to some degree in these political reactions against the abuses and the excesses of the rich and powerful. Now, let me just say from the outset, Romanticism is a very complex kettle of fish. It's an intricate subject to try and describe. So we're going to cover a lot of ground in this video. We're looking at roughly a half hour of chat about what Romanticism is. Some aspects of Romanticism, some works of Romanticism, could genuinely be described as reacting against that corruption or having a kind of political stake, political awareness. And I'll talk more about the folk culture revival that was part of Romanticism down the line. Also, the preoccupation with nature that was in some ways a kind of deliberately anti-capitalist or anti-materialist, anti-high society theme in Romantic literature. But for the moment, you might think of Herman Melville's Benito Cereno, which we've already looked at, as a really good example of this. Also, Robbie Burns' poem To a Mouse, or Percy Shelley's sonnet Ozymandias. On the other hand, some Romantic art might more accurately be described as simply feeding on the politics of the time, kind of as popular sentiment, fueling its own aesthetic with that overall atmosphere of malignant ill will, that antipathy against decadence. For instance, those emotions find a certain natural resonance in Gothic Romanticism's preoccupation with crumbling old castles, hauntings, gaunt, pale, beautiful women from forgotten noble families dying of mysterious wasting diseases, all that juicy stuff that our American friend Edgar Allan Poe is so famous for making us love. That phrase, Gothic Romanticism or Gothic Romance, I'll explain that in more detail as we go on as well. Of course, some of these Gothic-style works also reflect a kind of preoccupation with or appetite for the same hallmarks of wealth and status that other Romantic artists were striving to undermine or reject, right? If we're really all about the crumbling castles aesthetic, to what extent are we dependent on a love for what the castles stand for? It's subject for debate. Kind of part and parcel with that, exoticism was another hallmark of the Romantic movement, an almost mouth-watering kind of love for the trappings and beauty and intrigue of other cultures, far-off places, remote, unknown lands, or at least very different lands. Edgar Allan Poe, again, gives us many strong examples of that in his short stories, but there will be more to come. To give you a kind of TLDR summary of what I'm going to expound through this video, Regency values prioritized behavior and duty. The primary loyalty of a Regency mind was to the social order, and of course to God in the social order, since dominant conservative religious perspectives at this time regarded social position as basically ordained. We covered that a little bit in the Intro to Regency video. The thinking was you are where you are in the world because God placed you there. By contrast, Romantics prioritized experience. A Romantic's primary loyalty was to the natural order of creation as they understood it, and to the mysteries of God or the divine as revealed in nature through one's direct subjective experience of it. Romantics questioned social hierarchy and had a particular fascination with folk culture, often seeking to glorify common people and themes the way previous art movements had glorified the rich and powerful, or the gods of Olympus. That would have been typical subject matter. Not so much farmers, That's the contrast that we're working with. Where Enlightenment era artists of the 18th century, the previous century, had privileged the brain and its way of knowing, Romantic artists and thinkers privileged the heart, the emotions, the intuition, and their ways of knowing. As a result, Romanticism demonstrates a major, in crass language, I would say Romanticism has a major hard-on for all things magical, mythical, mysterious, whether those themes express themselves as dark and creepy, as in Gothic romance, or sublime and transcendent, as in the poetry of William Wordsworth. Think of the poem My Heart Leaps Up, or the American transcendentalists of New England, who I'll speak about momentarily. Timeline-wise, just to review, Romanticism in England and in Europe more widely coincides pretty closely with the English Regency period. We're talking 1790 to 1850, thereabouts. In America, it runs a little later, because everything happens later in America, because it takes a while for things to make their way across the pond. There are travel delays. So in America, Romanticism is a fully 19th century thing. It kicks in right around 1820 and tapers off around 1840. It's a bit shorter, but it has just as long a legacy as European Romanticism. So that's kind of the intro and overview. For the rest of this video, what I really want to do is just trawl through some of the major themes and features of Romanticism, unpack them a bit in terms of how they function and the different guises that they can appear in. One thing that you really need to know about Romanticism here from the get-go is that it was the spark point, the seminal moment for so many subsequent literary developments. A huge amount of what we now call genre fiction had its earliest roots in the Romantic movement and the developments of the Romantic movement. Fantasy, especially high fantasy, because high fantasy is traditionally a bit medievalist. Horror, especially Lovecraftian horror, sometimes called weird fiction. The mystery or detective genre, Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes owes his hat to Romanticism. Psychological thrillers, on and on and on. All roads lead to romance. I couldn't help myself. they all come back at one time or another to this art movement of Romanticism and the innovations that it made. The other thing that you really do need to know about Romanticism is that it never stopped. You know, where previous art movements, you know, like Arthurian romance as kind of a specific medieval thing, you know, like it had its day and then it was done. Romanticism never stopped. It's a bit like feminism in that it had a first wave and then it had subsequent waves, but it's still going. The time period that we use to describe the main wave of the original Romantic movement runs from the end of the 18th century to the early mid-19th century, or as I said, a bit later in the States. But you're going to see throughout the rest of our course that the Romantics have children and grandchildren. They have inheritors carrying on the hallmarks of this movement and innovating its expression in every subsequent era. Tennyson, our poet Tennyson, and the Bronte sisters, novelists in the Victorian period, absolutely their works would be neo-romanticism. They would be neo-romantics. The entire Irish revival of the 19th century, hugely informed by Romanticism. The 20th century gave rise to new labels like American Gothic or Southern Gothic in American literature, through writers like William Faulkner, who we'll touch on a little bit down the road, Flannery O'Connor, a Catholic writer that you might know. There's even a contemporary niche in Canadian literature, sometimes referred to as Canadian Gothic, which I could bang on about just forever. My master's thesis was written on a writer who falls within that niche, but we'll leave it there for now. First wave Romanticism, meat and potatoes, is what this video will be all about. Make a cup of tea, channel your inner waif, your inner moody artist, you channel the brooding, and get ready for some juicy stuff. My intro video on the Regency period made mention of Edmund Burke's influential essay or treatise, Reflections on the Revolution in France. Let me hit you with a quote that I didn't use in that video. Quote, it is ordained in the eternal constitution of things that men of intemperate minds cannot be free. Their passions forge their fetters. I'll read that again. It is ordained in the eternal constitution of things that men of intemperate minds, meaning immoderate or too wild, right? Not tame and modest and controlled. Men of intemperate minds cannot be free. Their passions forge their fetters or their chains. That is Mr. Edmund Burke. To this, the Romantics say, screw you and the horse that you rode in on. They are having none of it. Passion is the bread and butter of Romanticism in so many ways. And that will show itself through each of about 3 or 4 kind of core themes or dimensions of Romanticism that I'd like to track through with you here. First, I want to talk about Romanticism as having a distinctive preoccupation with nature. Nature is one of those eternal themes. Nature poetry, a love of nature, an exploration of nature. There has never been a time that human beings have not written about that, painted that, sung about that. That is permanent. But the Romantic approach to nature writing is a bit distinctive. So yes, a deepened appreciation of the beauties of nature was a major theme during the Romantic period, but that attention to nature gets leveraged in different directions depending on whose work you're reading and what their particular interests are. In some cases, the love of nature is, as mentioned before, an anti-capitalist theme, a sort of pushback against the values and preoccupations of urban high society. In other cases, It's more of a venue for introspection, for deep personal emotional reflection. Think about Thoreau's poem To a Marsh Hawk in Spring. In that context, nature is kind of a mirror through which the poet is able to process and contemplate his innermost feelings, his concerns and fears and pain over a sick wife. At other times, nature in romantic writing can be kind of just a vehicle for building up atmosphere, mystery, or even symbolic commentary on a piece's central subject matter. And we see this a little bit in Keats's poem La Belle Dame sa Merci. We see it other ways in The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Coleridge, and we'll see it a lot in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. The love of nature is also, in many romantic works, including Frankenstein, something like a spiritual preoccupation or even a spiritual devotion, a spiritual mode, if that might be more accurate to say. We see this especially with the Transcendentalists. The Transcendentalists were a small but very influential group of American poets clustered in New England during the period of American Romanticism, so fully mid-19th century. And their basic philosophy was that human beings' subjective experience of nature, our unmediated, heartfelt communion with and emotional contemplation of nature, that is the gateway to spiritual truth. This is how people come to know God, the divine, capital T, truth. The Transcendentalists held the details of definition pretty loosely, since definition was not their goal. Experiencing the divine was their goal. Knowing through encounter. We can see this attitude reflected really beautifully in poems like Ralph Waldo Emerson's The Snowstorm. Emerson basically wrote the book on Transcendentalism. He was kind of the pater familias of that club. We also see these attitudes, this transcendentalist worldview reflected in everyone's favorite since Breaking Bad became a thing, Mr. Walt Whitman's When I Heard the Learned Astronomer. Mwah. Great stuff. Even before Breaking Bad, it was great stuff. Classic exemplars of the transcendentalist vein in American Romanticism. Number 2, renewed interest in folklore and mythology. I haven't double-checked my dates on this, but I do believe that the Grimm's brothers are beginning to do their work, to be collecting their fairy tales right around this time. Romanticism reflected a voracious resurgence of interest during this time in folklore and folk culture generally. Keats's poem La Belle Dame sa Merci is a perfect example in that it draws on fairy lore that has roots in English folk culture as well as Irish mythology, concerning which I would be ever so happy to gush to you for hours and hours on end, because that is my bailiwick. Write me a separate email. I will tell you all the things. These themes, tropes, bodies of work from folklore and folk culture played into many of the interests of Romantic era artists all over Europe. For one thing, they supported some artists' desire to lionize the common man, the average person, as we've discussed. The popularity of Robert Burns' poetry, is a great example here. If you take a look at our poem To a Mouse, you'll see how Burns participates in this aspect of Romanticism, this lionizing the common man, by the fact that he wrote in his own natural Scots-English dialect. He gave it life, he put it on display, with unshakable faith in its inherent beauty, its power, rather than conforming to the norms of English diction at the time, which he might have done. And it's not just that Robbie Burns did this, but it's that his poetry became celebrated, as a sort of exemplar of romantic poetry. In terms of subject matter, also, Robert Burns, he wrote about his own life, his own concerns, and from his own perspective, and he was kind of nobody. Like, he was really kind of a nobody. And yes, his poem To a Mouse exemplifies all of this ever so beautifully. I'm completely in love with that particular poem and the way that it creates layers of reflection about how artificial social hierarchies belie and do violence to the natural equality not only of persons but of creatures. Fabulous stuff. Poetryfoundation.org, which I've directed you to many times, has this to say about it. Romantic poets could choose incidents and situations from common life as their subjects, describing them not in polished or high-flown diction, but instead in everyday speech, a selection of language really used by men or by people. Romanticism can do justice in these veins, in these patterns, to the disadvantaged, to the marginalized or forgotten by an increasingly urban and commercial culture. Rural workers, children, up until this point, children very much are to be seen and not heard. Their subjective experiences or worldviews are not considered. That begins to change here. Rural workers, children, the poor, the elderly, or the disabled, these are subjects that Romanticism really kind of applies itself to. Or Romanticism can testify to individuality simply by foregrounding the poet's own subjectivity at its most idiosyncratic or experimental. That's poetryfoundation.org as elaborated by me. And these powers and interests of Romanticism were attested by the collection and imitation of native folklore in England and the British Isles and Europe. Folk ballads and poetry, folk dance and music, all of these things became major subjects of interest. And indeed, this trend gave rise to what we now call the ballad revival in poetry. The medieval ballad form came back in a big way. People started trying to imitate and reprise and revive what the ballad was all about and what it could do, its norms, its aesthetic, and renovating it a little bit. But ballads suddenly really, they explode in a new way, beginning in the Romantic period and extending, throughout the 19th century, really. Another facet of this interest in folk culture and folklore, as I mentioned at the beginning, is exoticism. Romantics have a real predilection for the exotic, the far out, the remote. Interests in Eastern cultures, Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, the Far East, the Orient is a big thing. A major literary critic, Edward Said, has written just like a canon, permanently influential essay on what he called Orientalism, or a particular romantic attitude, perception of Eastern cultures that is well worth reading, and I may provide some excerpts from that work by Said on Orientalism into term 2 for you to reflect on. Letting that lie, element number 3 that I'd like to discuss is the rise of individualism through Romanticism. In many ways, Romanticism is the breakout point for true, deep-seated individualism in Western culture, and I just can't overstate what a big deal that is. If Regency-era norms were more collectivist in nature, if the dominant mindset was deference to the group rather than worship of the individual, Romanticism was the kickback against that norm. Romanticism is where that changed, and that shift, for better or for worse, remains with us to this day. To this day, Western cultures are known on the global stage for being unshakably individualist in our mindset. And that actually is one of the quickest ways that you can see revisionism in period pieces, you know, like movies or TV shows that take place in a historical era. If the time period and the costumes and the setting and everything are, say, Regency era, like in, I don't know, maybe the show Bridgerton. But if the speeches and behaviors and thoughts and attitudes of the characters are highly individualist, as opposed to being more collectivist and group deferential as they would have been at the time, you know that's your present day authors kind of making some edits to make that historical period more relatable, more palatable to modern audiences. One major expression of Romantic art's individualism was the theme of introspection, a turning in on the self and a really heightened examination of the human personality, its moods, its psychological mysteries and potential. Along with that came a fascination with the mystical, the subconscious, the supernatural, at which point we begin to wander off into dark romanticism or Gothic romance, but I'll get to that briefly here. Part and parcel with